Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe. Today I'll be continuing my examination of the city of Palanthas. The cataclysm that struck Krynn in the year 0 PC was of such great destruction that it sunk the whole of the Empire of Istar, or at least the main heartland of it. Because in truth, the Empire of Istar had gone on to extend and stretch its reach throughout almost all of Ansalon. Part of this empire was Palanthas. Palanthas had, during the rise of Istar, been almost entirely outshined as a city. Reduced to the periphery of the known world lies in the fact that Istar is far to the east, and that's where all of Ansalon's trade, political authority, and cultural supremacy stemmed from in this age. In later ages, Palanthas would reclaim its former glory, but not in this one. Palanthas, though, was also the site of a horrific incident during the Lost Battles, the bloody quarrel that shook Istar to its foundation, when King Priest Beldenus decided to pick a fight with the Order of Sorcery. It was his greed and lust for the wealth of the order that pushed him forward and propelled him to try to subjugate them to his own authority, then to disband and even destroy them. He managed to exile them in time to the Forest of Wayreth, while keeping the most vile mage as his advisor, as Feston Dantalus and Beldenus were not that different in personality. How Palanthas suffered to the Lost Battle was not as horrific as in other cities that housed one of the great towers of sorcery. The root of Palanthas' sorrow lies in a mage called Andrus. He would be possessed by Feston Dantalus and would cast himself upon the pointed gates of the Tower of Sorcery of Palanthas. With his last breaths, he would curse it to remain uninhabited until the master of the past and present had arrived. Ironically, this is where he had outsmarted Feston Dantalus, who had hoped to lay claim to the tower himself, just as the mayor of Palanthas wished to. But alas, Andros was a cleverer fox than anyone gave him credit for, since when he doomed the tower that way and cursed it, and it became deformed, the master of the past was certainly Feston Dantalus, but the master of the present, and I would argue even to an extent the future, in a way, was Raceland. So the curse that Andros was taught to perform by Feston Dantalus reversed and kind of smacked him in the back of the head so that he face planted. During the cataclysm, officially, Palanthas did not suffer much to the sorrows of the cataclysm. The great breaking of the continent into multiple pieces, the great wars that haunted Ansalon afterwards, and the great famines that struck many key areas throughout the continent would not end up haunting Palanthas. That said, in the wiki it says that Palanthas was not victim to any great plague like the rest of Krynn was. I would argue that's false. It is very likely that Palanthas had a larger population in the time of Istar, that just as every other place throughout the continent had grown in population by probably a few million, and war and plague and famine depopulated a great deal of the continent, Palanthas was likely depopulated by way of plague, as plague tends to hit more populated areas. Populous areas such as Constantinople, Athens, Rome, throughout history, have always been the most likely victims of great plagues. It's why France and England, for example, suffered far worse than Scotland did to the Black Plague, which, for example, to Scotland was little more than a nuisance. Same with Ireland. That said, the trouble for Palanthas was that, just as it likely suffered massive depopulation, some of this sorrow was improved by the fact that there would be people who would flee to Palanthas, not enough to repopulate all the abandoned houses of the city. Yes, a great many were probably abandoned when the tower was cursed. It did not suffer as the rest of the continent did, given that relatively it escaped unscathed, except for probably plague. Palanthas would retain its port and retain its title as the Jewel of Salamnia throughout the Age of Despair. Palanthas would play a key role in the War of the Lance, because the taking of the city could spell nothing but doom for the whole of the continent. Thankfully, during the War of the Lance, during both assaults by Kitiara Ufmatar and her Blue Dragon armies, she wouldn't take the city. The second attempt by her to take the city is called the Blue Ladies' War. In reality, this should be probably considered part of the War of the Lance. As to the first attack, would result in a heated battle that cost many brave Solamnic knights their lives, most notably Sturm Brightblade. But the High Clerist's Tower would stand strong, and Palanthas would not fall to Takhisis. Rewarded for her treachery towards Ariakas, Kitiara would lay claim to the title of leader of the dragon armies. However, her next assault, though substantially better planned than her previous, would end up unsuccessful. Kitiara would not take the city of Palanthas, and much of the damaged parts of the city would be rebuilt in time. So it happens that Kitiara, much as she wished to take the city as her own crown jewel, she could not get past the walls or the strong spirit of the people of Palanthas. And it is noteworthy that in spite of the endemic war, plague, famine, and the many assaults against their walls, doubtlessly by not just Kitiara but many brigands and lords who wished for the city for themselves, Palanthas always stayed strong. And this is a good lesson to take from the story of Palanthas, is that it is only through overcoming our differences and coming together that you can build strong walls, high ones that could guard against any enemy. So with that said, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button if you enjoyed this video, as though you were Kitiara on Sky smashing the High Clerist's Tower in Sturm to itty bitty pieces.